To finish off our series on food safety, we're looking at government agencies as well as some food preservation processes. So looking at things like the FDA, the USDA, the EPA, and a process referred to as the HACCP. What is that? Let's start off with the government agencies first. So the first one is going to be the Food and Drug Administration, known as the FDA. Now the FDA is going to have authority to approve all ingredients in your food. So any additives, any preservatives, anything that's added into the food to make it what it is, the FDA has to approve those different pieces and parts. It's basically trying to make sure that everything that goes into your food is safe. It's also given authority over safety labeling. So any foods, any safety warnings, anything that goes into that is also falling under the FDA. Now, the FDA can issue product recalls. You may have heard of things like E. coli and spinach as a recall. But the interesting thing here is, usually the FDA doesn't have to issue these. Most of the recalls you hear about are all done voluntarily. The companies that have put out the food that is contaminated or problematic with poison or toxin or whatever happened to it, a lot of times those companies themselves will recall the items before the FDA even steps in. It's just more of a good business practice. Do you really want your customers getting sick, potentially dying from things you had out there? They're not going to want to buy what you have anymore. So most companies will have voluntary recalls to get the things off the shelf before the FDA has to step in. Rolling on to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, known as the USDA. The USDA is actually headed up by the Secretary of Agriculture. And their main goal is to help protect our food system. Basically trying to have an overarching theme here to make sure everything's safe. It's looking into and making sure the laws that are governing agriculture, the laws that are governing ranching or ranchers, are all being enforced. Making sure the food that's being produced is properly following all the rules and regulations. Making sure that the pesticides being used in the fields are approved and not the ones that are banned or illegal. Making sure that all the livestock feed is up to par and meeting the standards for those livestock. The idea is trying to ensure the whole process is all working and all done within guidelines for safety purposes. Now it's also tasked with another function. It's meant to help protect our natural resources. So it's kind of looking out to make sure things aren't getting dumped in the wrong places or having problems in that case. And one more thing, it deals with trade agreements. So when you start looking into import and export of food, it's making sure that all the exports going out are meeting standards, but also all the imports coming in are meeting the standards we have for our food safety. Try to make sure that everything coming in is protected for the end consumer. So that's the FDA, the USDA, and how about the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA? You're saying EPA, that's environment. True, the EPA doesn't have a lot to do with the food directly, but what it does do is it deals with water safety. And I don't know about you guys, but water, well, it's not necessarily a lipid, a carbohydrate, a protein, it's not a vitamin or mineral, but you still need it. So the EPA is dealing with our water safety, making sure that various different municipalities are all having their water treatment facilities up to a certain to a certain level. Trying to make sure that those municipalities don't have contamination or have any toxins or anything like heavy metals in their water sources. And if any of that is found, then usually remediation processes are brought into place. Ways of fixing and getting rid of what the issue is. So that is the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency. But it also, besides dealing with just the water sources for what we drink, also goes into the livestock side of things. it makes sure that the water sources that are used in livestock are also basically meeting certain laws and adequate for what they need. So really, it's kind of looking at not just our water as in the municipalities, but also out on the farms for the livestock to make sure that their water sources are adequate. Because if their water sources are contaminated, and then they become contaminated, let's say a cow, for example, and then that cow is sent to butcher, and then you eat that meat, by eating that meat, you potentially can become contaminated. So you can have ingestion of whatever that pathogen or toxin or whatever it is could be. So the EPA is looking at both the municipality water source, what we drink, as well as feed for the livestock, so the water supply for the livestock. Now, beyond all three of these different agencies, there is always still a potential for foodborne illness in the food processing part of things. So really, the FDA looks at the ingredients going in. The USDA looking at the laws being followed, but still, even with the EPA and water, they're not looking at the actual processing as directly. So what happens is, there are still strict guidelines and strict rules here to follow. And what's going on is, you have something called the Hazardous Analysis Critical Control Points, known as HACCP. So Hazardous Analysis Critical Control Points. Well, these actually are being developed and constantly modified by the actual companies that use them. So the industries themselves are making these up. The idea is they look at where the potential problems could be. So where is an issue of food safety in this process? Or where could contamination occur in that process? So they try to figure out all the points that could be problematic and then follow guidelines and make guidelines to make sure those don't become problematic. The goal is trying to have as much food safety as possible. Because remember, if anything is produced as contaminated, they have to recall all that and just trash it. That's a huge loss of money. So it's in these companies' best interest to try and have this whole analysis of the process to limit contamination, to limit exposure to pathogens. So what these companies have done is they've kind of created this 7-step process over here. And this 7-step process is actually had become now required by both the USDA and the FDA. For the USDA, they require the HACCP for all meat and poultry. That's why if you're ever buying meat or poultry, it's USDA approved, because it's following this process. It's making sure that meat and poultry has met the guidelines laid out in the HACCP. The FDA, well, they're specifically looking at seafood, low-acid canned food, and juices. And the same processes are in place there. So therefore, it's FDA approved in those cases. Every other industry is voluntary. Now, with that being said, the majority of the other industries still follow it anyway. It's in their best interest to prevent any contamination or pathogen exposure. So really, most companies, even without being required, are still doing this because it's better for their bottom line, better for their profits. Now, let's switch gears a little more into food life and food shelf life. Foodborne illnesses, we know, I've talked about them all in extent, bacteria, viruses, all the rest of the pathogens. But these foodborne illnesses, they've been around since human beings have been around. So humans have always tried to figure out how to lengthen the shelf life of food. If we go back in time, look at things like salting, some canning, or just basic drying of the food. By doing this, the drying, bacteria can't grow as easily. Canning, depriving of oxygen. Salting, you're also helping it dehydrate and basically create a sodium-heavy environment that most bacteria can't grow in. Now, all of these can still be used today and are still readily used quite often. But if anything goes wrong, obviously the canning doesn't hold enough oxygen out, so there's still oxygen there. Bacteria can outgrow. If the salting didn't really get into everything there might be a patch where the bacteria can grow. So while it is useful, it's got to be very carefully done to make sure you have the process down so you don't have any issues there. But even with all those exposures of salt or canning or going into the drying process, while it might elongate the shelf life, there still is a shelf life. You can't say, oh yeah, that's going to last the next 20 years. Not going to happen. So there are now more modern methods also that have been developed. Things like irradiation, pasteurizing, and just in general, freezer and refrigerator. Now, these can also help elongate the shelf life. But again, there's limitations. If you're looking at fresh fruit, let's say, peaches or grapes or raspberries, those still have a shelf life even with trying to have any of these processes. When you start getting a little more preservation with the irradiation and the pasteurizing, it can help increase the shelf life even longer for those different foods. But there still is limitation. You're not going to want to have something sitting in your freezer for the next 5 years and then eat it. It might have some issues with taste. It potentially could have some issues with bacteria, but bacteria can't really grow very well in a frozen environment. So more often than not, it is still going to help out, but there are limitations. If not for pathogen, then it might just be for the taste, the texture of the food. But maybe the largest increase in shelf life and lifespan of food comes from the processing of the food. Now, there are benefits, things like extending shelf life. There are drawbacks, the idea of preservations, the idea of additives. Now, these preservations or preservatives, salt, pectin, keratin. Well, the salt helps dehydrate and create an environment that the bacteria can't grow in. Pectin is more like a jelly-like substance, helps create a little different texture to it. And keratin, that's color-based. Well, that means these are still extra things that have been added in, though, that weren't in that food naturally. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It's for each person to make up their own mind. So there's positives and there are negatives. All comes down to what you're feeling and what you want to be ingesting. But the goal is here, help protect the consumer from pathogens. And that's what they're doing. Now, another thing that helps out with the positive note here, these new processes, or even the old ones too for that matter, all increasing shelf life. Pair that with transportation methods we have, and you can get pretty much any type of food to anywhere in the world. If you're in the middle of the country, you're probably not going to simply just walk out the door and grab some fresh seafood because it's hundreds or thousands of miles away depending on the country. Now, with the modern techniques of freezing and preservation and transportation, you can get seafood anywhere. It's always readily available. Or in the middle of winter, you're not going to have fresh grown fruits and vegetables if there's snow on the ground. Well, they're being shipped in from different places and different climates. Again, different processes help elongate and make things available almost anywhere. So that can be a good thing to have more variety of the food that you want to eat. Now, with that preservation though, has come a huge increase in sodium consumption. And that could be more of a downfall, more of a drawback, because sodium consumption levels have really increased in recent years. By increasing all this sodium, that can have health detrimental effects as one goes through life. Can cause problems with blood pressure, can cause problems with the heart, can cause problems just in general with so many different things that you gotta kind of watch out for how much sodium are you truly ingesting and how much are you eating. So that could be beneficial for preservation purposes, but the amounts could become detrimental if you don't watch that. But there are benefits also. You can add in or fortify vitamins and minerals. So you're adding in more nutrients into a food. It can help with the color or the taste or the texture of food, making it so it looks more appealing, tastes more appealing, it's more palatable. So again, benefits, detriments. But the big thing across all of this, all of these food additives, whether they're for increasing nutrients or for preservation, they've all been approved by the FDA. that means they're all considered safe in the recommended doses. Now again, I say recommended doses because anything that is a preservative, if you have super high doses, even salt, could become problematic. So it's all about balancing out how much is being consumed. Really what it comes down to, personal preference. What do you want to put in your body? What do you want to keep out of your body? It's all the choices by reading the labels, looking at what you want to eat. So overall, food safety and what's being consumed are a lot of times coming down to personal choices and how you're dealing with the food that you handle. Reading the labels, keeping food contaminants separate, not having a cutting board for both meats and vegetables that are not being washed. So keeping things separate are helping out. So really here are 4 main steps to kind of think about. First of all, make sure to thoroughly wash hands and foods as needed. So if you're doing food prep, wash your hands. If you're touching raw meat or raw chicken, make sure you wash your hands before you start touching those leafy greens that aren't going to be cooked. Separate different foods. That way you don't have the cross-contamination. So don't use the same cutting board, like cut your chicken here and then put your lettuce on, cut at the same time. That knife, that cutting board are contaminated with potentially pathogens from the chicken. Cook thoroughly to recommended temperatures. The temperatures given for each meat is meant to prevent those pathogens that are found in that item from surviving and being passed on to you. So cooking thoroughly helps prevent pathogen ingestion. And then keeping certain foods cold if they're meant to be cold, frozen if they're meant to be frozen, or once you cook them, hot if they're hot. By staying out of that room, that middle danger zone, helps prevent bacteria or viruses or anything else from multiplying in that food. So the idea is follow a few rules, keep yourself safe, and hopefully don't get sick. Until the next video.